Welcome to the Yankee Air Museum Historic Presentation Series. I'm Dennis Skupinski, and I'll be presenting for May 2020. My presentation is the Homefront Campaign during World War II. Before I get into the campaign, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself. I've been a life member of Yankee Air Museum, and I've been a member since 2013. I'm on the Public Relations Committee. I do the Google AdWords, and also I supply brochures for the Michigan Department of Transportation Welcome Centers. Now to the presentation. The Homefront Campaign during World War II. There were 5 major campaigns during World War II. The African Campaign, the China-Burma-India Campaign, the European Campaign, and the Pacific Campaign. The 4 major campaigns I listed all had various sub-theaters of operations, such as in the European campaign. We had a campaign going on in Italy. We also had an air war. We had the invasion of southern France and the invasion of Normandy. The most important campaign during World War II, however, I believe is the Homefront campaign, because without the Homefront campaign, the United States would not be able to produce the goods it needed to use to beat the Axis powers, which were Italy, Germany, and Japan. The Homefront campaign was different from the other campaigns in that the other campaigns were military operations. This was a civilian operation and actually manufacturing. The government wanted to release certain amounts of information to keep the public informed and also build their morale so that their war production could continue on, even though times were hard. They had to prioritize national resources, which was known as rationing, to make sure that we had the right material at the right time at the right factory. They also had to do the same for manpower, because we didn't want some of our skilled trades going off to fight the war and not having skilled people to build some of our more sophisticated weapon systems. Homefront also had to be protected because we had external forces against us and also internal. And then also our leadership. People had to have confidence in our leadership to know that when they came out with a plan, that this plan would help them win the war. Propaganda is the use of information to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Propaganda was used by the United States government to demonize the opposing forces, such as the one poster on the left which says, "Hitler wants us to believe that, and the Americans will not be fooled." But besides external threats, there's also internal threats, as the poster on the right, where her careless talk cost lives. During World War II and the Homefront, the United States government used propaganda to unify the thought and behavior of American citizens and factory workers. One of the positive uses of this propaganda was to build morale. Morale-boosting propaganda encouraged workers to work harder, even under extreme hardship. As you notice the posters here, we have "United We Are Strong" showing factory smokestacks firing guns at the enemy. We also have "Now All Together," the center poster, showing what the value of teamwork. And finally the poster on the right, patting the girl on the back for keeping quality production up. War production, the mobilization of funds, people, natural resources, and material for production and supply of military equipment and military forces during World War II was a critical component of the war effort. During the conflict, the Allies, the United States, Great Britain, France, etc., outpaced the Axis powers, Japan, Italy, and Germany, in most production categories. Access to the funding and industrial resources necessary to sustain the war effort was linked to their respective economic and political alliances. The 2 posters on this slide symbolize America's production. One on the left, the big guns of the Homefront, showing that factory smokestacks producing war material was just as important as artillery was on the battlefield. And the one on the right, Uncle Sam rolling up his sleeves, showing that America was ready to fight with all of its industrial might. During World War II, a heavy burden was put on U.S. supplies of basic materials like food, shoes, metal, paper, and rubber. The Army and Navy were growing as well as the nation's effort to aid its allies overseas. Civilians still needed these materials for their consumer goods as well. To meet this surging demand, the federal government took steps to conserve critical supplies, including establishing a rationing system that impacted virtually every family in the United States. Rationing involves setting limits on purchasing of certain high-demand items. The government issued a number of points to each person, even babies, which had to be turned in along with the money to purchase the goods made with restricted items. In 1943, for example, a pound of bacon cost 30 cents, but a shopper would have to turn in 7 ration points to buy the meat. These points came in the form of stamps that were distributed to citizens in books throughout the war. The Office of Price Administration, the OPA, was in charge of this program, but it relied heavily on volunteers to hand out the ration books and explain the system to consumers and merchants. By the end of the war, about 5,600 local rationing boards staffed by over 100,000 citizen volunteers were administering the program. Tires were the first product to be rationed, starting in January of 1942, just several weeks after the attack of Pearl Harbor. The government began rationing certain foods in May of 1942, starting with sugar. Coffee was added to the list that November. The government faced several challenges. First, there was a shortage of manufacturing goods. Next, there was a shortage of civilian labor because a vast number of men who would have normally done this work were in the military now. The federal government and the war industries sought to solve the problem by partly employing women to fill the gap. Controlling and regulating supply of labor was a function of the War Manpower Commission, created in 1942 by an executive order from President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt also in 1942 created by executive order the National War Labor Board, which was created to prevent work stoppages between disputes between labor and management. Also, he created the Office of Price Administration, which was to control wages and prices. Defending the home front was a coalition of the United States government military forces such as the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and also the State National Guard. But when the State National Guard were federalized, most governors in the states had to employ their home defense forces, which were created during the First World War. For example, in April of 1917, Michigan's Governor Sleeper was faced with a dilemma. The National Guard troops were federalized and went overseas, and so he created the Michigan State Troops. Mounted troops would become the Michigan State Police, and dismounted would become Michigan State Volunteer Defense Force. These forces were recalled during World War II. During 1943, in Detroit, a race riot appeared, and Michigan State troops were called in to stop the violence. During World War II, the Michigan State troops were used to protect facilities such as storage of gasoline, train yards, bridges, tunnels, and anything else the governor deemed worthy of sabotage by foreign agents. The most important part of the home front campaign was leadership, and the workers needed to have confidence in their leaders. The President, Franklin Roosevelt, was in charge of everything. Then under him was the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stinson, and Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, George C. Marshall. Under him was the Director of War Production, Lieutenant General William S. Knudsen. These men would be the people who decided what the United States would produce for the various campaigns around the world. The Director of War Production, Lieutenant General William S. Knudsen, formerly of Ford Motor Company and lastly of General Motors, would be the person responsible for producing the goods of war. In January of 1942, William Knudsen was commissioned a lieutenant general in the U.S. Army, the only civilian ever to join the Army at such a high initial rank, and appointed as Director of Production, Office of the Under-Secretary of War. In this capacity, he worked as a consultant and a troubleshooter for the War Department. William Knudsen was chosen by President Roosevelt to be the Director of War Production because of the recommendation from Bernard Baruch, who was the chair of War Industries Board during World War I. During World War I, President Wilson was faced with the same situation that President Roosevelt was faced with, turning a civilian economy into a wartime economy. Mr. Baruch was chosen by President Wilson because he was already advising him on the commission to the Council of National Defense in 1916. In 1918, President Wilson made him chair of the War Industries Board. Bernard Baruch's position reported directly to the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and his job was to turn the United States peacetime economy into a wartime economy. He had to allocate resources, standardize products, set quotas, and allocate raw materials. The problem Mr. Baruch had was he had a lot of responsibility, but not much authority, and really lacked the teeth to get a number of things accomplished during World War I. Mr. Baruch recognized the shortfalls of his position, and he recommended to President Wilson so that the same mistakes would not happen again during World War II. In 1940, President Roosevelt asked William Knudsen to come to Washington to help with war production. Mr. Knudsen was appointed as chairman of the Office of Production Management and member of the National Defense Advisory Commission. William Knudsen arrived in New York in February of 1900 from Copenhagen, Denmark. Mr. Knudsen was working for the John R. Kime Company of Buffalo, New York, when the Ford Motor Company bought it in 1911 for his steel stamping experience and tooling. William Knudsen worked for Ford from 1911 until 1921, a decade that saw the formative development of modern assembly line and true mass production. Working first with Ford Motor Company and later for General Motors, William Knudsen became an expert on mass production and a skilled manager. William Knudsen was president of the Chevrolet division of General Motors from 1924 until 1937 and was president of General Motors from 1937 until 1940. One statistic that stands out that tells a conversion from civilian to a wartime economy that William Knudsen helped produce was airplane production. In 1939, the United States produced 3,000 airplanes. In 1945, that was over 300,000. William Knudsen was quoted as saying, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he has never seen nor dreamed possible." Lieutenant General William Knudsen was the commanding general of the home front. He was an expert in mass production, a skilled manager, and knew how to inspire the people around him. One of the recommendations from Bernard Baruch to President Roosevelt was the creation of the National War Production Board. And here's some of its members. They had the chairman was Donald M. Nelson. It included the Secretaries of War, Navy, and Agriculture, Lieutenant General in charge of War Department Procurement, Director of the Office of Price Administration, Federal Loan Administrator, Chair of the Board of Economic Warfare, Special Assistant to the President for the Defense Aid Program. The War Production Board had advisory, policy making, and progress reporting divisions. These were all recommendations from Bernard Baruch from his experience during the First World War. The War Production Board and the nation's factories created a great turnaround. Military aircraft production, which totaled 6,000 in 1940, jumped to 85,000 in 1943. Factories that made silk ribbons now produce parachutes. Automobile factories built tanks. Typewriter companies converted to machine guns. Undergarment manufacturers sewed mosquito netting. And a roller coaster manufacturer converted it to the production of bomb repair platforms. The War Production Board ensured that each factory received the materials it needed to produce the most war goods in the shortest time. Two posters from World War II from the National War Production Board are very interesting. They are shown here. The one on the left shows War Production Key being given to Uncle Sam, which is the key to victory. The one on the right is a national symbol for the War Production Board, which shows an eagle clinching an artillery shell, which shows a cooperation between the production and the government, which was very essential for the United States to win World War II. And to show the larger picture to just how important the United States home front campaign was during World War II, let's take a look at some numbers. From 1942 until 1945, the War Production Board supervised the production of $183 billion worth of weapons and supplies, about 40% of the world's output of munitions. Britain and the USSR and other allies produced an additional 30%, while the Axis powers could only produce 30%, which meant the Allies produced 70% of the war's weapons and supplies, while the Axis powers could only produce 30%. Meanwhile, one-fourth of the United States output was warplanes and one-fourth was warships, while the standard of living for the United States civilian barely dropped, unlike those of other countries around the world during World War II. The Second World War was a war of nation versus nation, which meant its military and economic power were fighting another country's military and economic power. The United States homefront campaign contributed greatly to the United States' overall victory with the Allies. And once again, let's review the key points of the homefront campaign. One was the government released information, which is propaganda, to make sure that it boosted morale of the civilians at home. This way we could get more production from our existing workers. War production was manufacturing of war goods, and this was increased by not only proper planning, but also the morale increase from our civilian workers. Rationing made everybody feel like they were part of the total war effort, where a shared source of misery. Manpower allocation made sure we had enough soldiers for the front lines, but also we kept skilled labor to work in our factories to make some of our more sophisticated weapons. Our home defense was ensured by a coalition between national forces, which is our military and Coast Guard, and also some of our local or state forces, such as the Michigan State Troops, who not only protected us from sabotage, but also protected us from things like the Detroit race riots and labor unrest. Finally, leadership and confidence in the chain of command. Our President, the Secretary of War, Henry Stinson, and Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army, George Marshall, helped set the requirements for production, where Lieutenant General William Knudsen made sure those production numbers were met. One interesting local story from the Homefront campaign involves a local woman who was a Rosie the Riveter, a woman who toiled in the defense industry at the Willow Run plant. In 1942, bandleader Kay Kaiser wrote a hit song about Rosie the Riveter. Also, Walter Pidgeon, one of Hollywood's leading men, traveled to the Willow Run aircraft plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, to make a promotional film encouraging the sale of war bonds. One of the women employed at the factory, Rose Will Monroe, was a riveter involved with the construction of B-24 bombers. Monroe was a real-life Rosie the Riveter and was recruited to appear in Pidgeon's films.
All of the girls attend their favorite cocktail bar, sipping dry martinis, munching caviar. There's a girl who's really putting them to shame. Rosie, Rosie is her name.